The Arizona heat was unbearable that Tuesday morning when I found the envelope slipped under my front door. My hands shook as I tore it open, reading the words that made my world collapse. You are hereby notified that you no longer have permission to enter this property. The letterhead belonged to a law firm I'd never heard of, but the signature at the bottom belonged to someone I knew better than anyone else in this world. My son Daniel. I had to sit down on my kitchen chair, the same one where I'd helped him with homework every night for 12 years. The same chair where I'd held him when he cried about his father's death. The same chair where I'd celebrated when he got his first job, his first promotion, his wedding day. Now that chair felt like it was made of ice. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching. 3 weeks. That's how long it had been since Daniel last called me. 3 weeks of silence and now this. I dialed his number with trembling fingers, but it went straight to voicemail. His voice, so formal and distant, asked me to leave a message. I couldn't speak. What do you say to your own child when they've just legally banned you from the home you gave them? When he finally answered my call 2 days later, after I'd tried 17 times, his voice was cold as winter. You did what you needed to do as a mother, he said like he was reading from a script. But I don't owe you anything, Mom. Nothing at all. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered on the tile floor. I stared at it lying there. This little device that had just delivered the most painful words I'd ever heard. My own son, the baby I'd nursed through pneumonia, the toddler who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, the teenager who'd promised he'd always take care of me when I got old, had just told me I meant nothing to him. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the will I'd written 6 months ago, tucked away in my bedroom drawer. Daniel was listed as my only heir. Everything I owned, everything I'd worked for, everything I'd saved, would go to him when I died. The house, my retirement savings, even my grandmother's wedding ring from 1943. All of it was meant for the boy who just told me he owed me nothing. Let me tell you who I am because maybe then you'll understand why this hurt so much. My name is Eleanor Santos, but everyone calls me Ellie. I'm 72 years old, and I spent 38 years teaching 3rd grade at Sunrise Elementary School. I never missed a day unless I was in the hospital, and even then I tried to go in. I believed in hard work, kindness, and always putting family first. My husband Robert died when Daniel was only 7. Cancer took him in 8 months, and suddenly I was a single mother with a mortgage, a broken-hearted little boy, and no idea how I was going to manage. But I did manage. I worked extra hours tutoring kids after school. I took in sewing on weekends. I sold everything valuable we owned except my grandmother's ring, because I wanted to give that to Daniel's future wife someday. Daniel was everything to me. He was curious about everything, always asking questions that made me think. Why is the sky blue? How do fish breathe underwater? What happens to people when they die? I bought him books at garage sales, took him to the library every Saturday, and read to him every single night until he was 14 and told me he was too old for bedtime stories. I was so proud when he graduated college. The first person in our family to get a degree. I cried during his graduation ceremony, sitting in those uncomfortable plastic chairs, watching my baby boy walk across that stage in his cap and gown. He got a good job at a financial planning company, married a lovely girl named Jessica, and bought a beautiful house with a big backyard and a swimming pool. For a while everything was perfect. Daniel called me twice a week. They invited me for Sunday dinners. I watched their kids, my precious grandchildren Emma and Lucas, every Friday night so Daniel and Jessica could have date nights. I felt useful, loved, needed. But then something started changing. The phone calls became once a week, then every other week, then just holidays and birthdays. The Sunday dinners stopped. When I asked about Friday babysitting, Jessica would say they had other plans or the kids were too busy with activities. I told myself it was natural. Young families get busy. Kids grow up and need their space. 2 years ago I had my accident. Slipped on a wet floor at the grocery store and broke my hip in 3 places. The recovery was brutal. 6 weeks in a hospital bed, then months of physical therapy just to walk again. I couldn't drive for 4 months. I couldn't cook or clean properly. For the first time in my life I needed help. That's when Daniel and Jessica made their offer. They had a guest house behind their main house. A cute little 2-bedroom place with its own kitchen and bathroom. Come live with us, Mom, Daniel said. We want to take care of you now. I was hesitant because I'd always been independent, but the idea of being close to my grandchildren made my heart sing. The first few months were wonderful. I helped with dinner when I could. I drove Emma and Lucas to school sometimes. I baked cookies and made my famous chicken soup when anyone felt sick. I felt like I had a purpose again, like I was part of a real family. But slowly things began to shift. Jessica started sighing when I knocked on their back door to bring over fresh bread. Daniel began texting me instead of walking the 30 feet from his house to mine when he wanted to talk. I heard conversations through the thin walls that weren't meant for my ears. She treats this place like she owns it, Jessica said one night. I just want our privacy back. I pretended I didn't hear it. I started knocking before entering, even though they told me to treat their home like my own. I stayed in my little guest house most days, reading books and watching old movies, trying to make myself as invisible as possible. Then came the paperwork. Daniel knocked on my door one Tuesday morning with a folder full of legal documents. It's just cleanup stuff, Mom, he explained. Making sure everything is organized in case something happens. You know, for tax purposes. The papers transferred ownership of my old house, the one I'd signed over to him when I moved in, into some kind of trust. It looked official and complicated, full of words I didn't understand. I trust you, I told him, signing where he pointed. He smiled, but something felt different about that smile. It didn't reach his eyes the way it used to when he was little and I'd surprise him with his favorite cookies. A few weeks later, strange things started happening. My cable got disconnected without warning. Food disappeared from my refrigerator. The thermostat in my little house suddenly required a password I didn't have, and when I asked Daniel about it, he said it was for security reasons because of the grandchildren. But the grandchildren never came to my house anymore. Emma and Lucas, who used to run over every afternoon asking for snacks and stories, suddenly seemed to avoid me. When I waved at them from my window, they'd look away quickly and hurry inside their house. I started feeling like a stranger in what was supposed to be my home. Every morning, I'd wake up wondering what small freedom would disappear next. Every evening, I'd go to bed feeling more isolated than I had since Robert died. That's when the legal notice arrived, the one that started this whole nightmare. As I sat in my little kitchen that Tuesday morning, holding that piece of paper that legally banished me from the property I'd helped pay for, I realized something that made my stomach turn. This wasn't random. This wasn't sudden. This had been planned. I walked to my bedroom and opened the drawer where I kept important papers. There it was, my will written in my own handwriting just 6 months ago. I leave everything to my beloved son Daniel Santos, knowing he will use it wisely and with love. I'd been so happy when I wrote those words, so confident that I was giving my life's work to someone who would treasure it and remember me fondly. Now, staring at that will with the legal notice still in my other hand, I felt something shift inside me. Something cold and determined and angry. Not the screaming, crying kind of angry, but the quiet kind that makes you think clearly for the first time in months. If Daniel thought I was just a helpless old woman who would accept this treatment without fighting back, he was about to learn something important about the woman who raised him. You don't survive 43 years of single motherhood, work 3 jobs to put your kid through college, and rebuild your life after losing your husband by being weak. I folded the legal notice carefully and put it in my purse. Then I called my old friend Patricia, who'd retired from teaching the same year I did. Pat, I said when she answered, I need to ask you something and I need you to be completely honest with me. If someone you loved was treating you like a burden, what would you do? There was a long pause before she answered. Honey, what's going on? I think, I said slowly, I'm about to find out who my son really is. The next morning, I woke up with a strange feeling in my chest. Not sadness, not anger, but something sharper. Awareness. I made my coffee the same way I had for 2 years in this little guest house, but now I noticed things I'd been ignoring. The way the morning light seemed dimmer than it used to be. The way sounds from the main house had become muffled, like they were deliberately keeping me out of their lives. I decided to pay attention. Really pay attention. Started with small things. On Wednesday, I went to adjust the temperature because my old bones were aching from the cold. The thermostat blinked at me with a red light and a message I'd never seen before. Access denied, contact administrator. I stared at it for a full minute. Administrator? This was a house thermostat, not some government computer. When I called Daniel about it, His explanation felt rehearsed. "Oh, that's the new smart system, Mom. It's connected to our main house for energy efficiency. Emma and Lucas were playing with it and changing the temperature all the time, so we had to lock it down." But Emma and Lucas hadn't been in my house in weeks. I knew this because I'd been hoping they would visit, watching for them every day. I didn't say this to Daniel. Instead, I just said, "Okay, honey. Could you set it to 75 for me?" "Sure, Mom. I'll take care of it." He never did. The next strange thing happened on Friday. I'd gone grocery shopping, something that took me much longer than it used to because of my hip. When I came home and started putting things away, I noticed items missing from my pantry. A can of soup, 2 boxes of crackers, a jar of peanut butter that had been nearly full. At first I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I hadn't bought those things after all. Maybe my memory was playing tricks on me. But then I found the empty peanut butter jar in my trash can, and I knew I hadn't eaten it. I just opened it 3 days ago. I started making lists, writing down everything I bought, everything I had in my cabinets, everything I ate. It sounds paranoid, but something in my gut told me to document things. Within a week, the pattern was clear. Food was disappearing regularly, and not just snacks. Whole meals worth of ingredients would vanish overnight. On Sunday, I decided to bring Daniel and Jessica some homemade rolls, the kind I used to make for Sunday dinners when they still invited me. I walked to their back door and turned the handle like I had hundreds of times before. It was locked. Not just the regular lock, but the deadbolt too, locked from the inside. I knocked and waited. Through the glass, I could see Jessica moving around the kitchen. She saw me but didn't come to the door immediately. Instead, she called out, "Just a minute." I heard her talking to someone, though I couldn't make out the words. When she finally opened the door, her smile looked painted on. "Oh, hi, Eleanor. Sorry, we were just organizing things in here." I looked past her into the kitchen. Every surface was spotless. No signs of any organizing happening anywhere. "I brought you some fresh rolls," I said, holding out the basket covered with my favorite tea towel. "That's so sweet," she said, taking the basket but not inviting me in. "We're actually about to head out, though. Family stuff, you know? Family stuff." I was family, wasn't I? Or at least I used to be. That evening, I sat by my window and watched their house. The lights were on, and I could see shadows moving around inside. They never left. There was no family stuff. They had just wanted me to leave. The real wake-up call came during what I thought was going to be a normal family dinner. Daniel had grilled hamburgers outside and invited me to join them. For an hour it felt like old times. Emma told me about her science project. Lucas showed me a magic trick he'd learned at school. Jessica actually laughed at one of my stories about my teaching days. I offered to help clear the plates, grateful to be useful again. As I carried dishes toward the kitchen, I heard Jessica and Daniel talking in the hallway. They thought I was farther away than I was. "I can't do this forever," Jessica was saying, her voice tight with frustration. "She acts like she lives here." "She does live here," Daniel replied, but his voice was tired, like he was explaining something for the 100th time. "You know what I mean. In our space. Always around. I feel like I can't relax in my own home. And frankly, Daniel, I don't want to be taking care of your mother when she gets really old. I didn't sign up for that." My hands froze on the plates. The dish towel in my hand suddenly felt heavy as a brick. "She's not that bad yet," Daniel said. "And she won't be around forever. Won't be around forever." The casual way he said it, like he was talking about an unwanted houseplant that would eventually die on its own. I set the plates down quietly and walked back to my little house without saying goodbye. They didn't even notice I was gone. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and everything started making sense. The locked doors, the missing food, the controlled thermostat, the legal notice banning me from the property. This wasn't random meanness. This was a plan. But a plan for what? "She does live here," Daniel replied, but his voice was tired, like he was explaining something for the 100th time. "You know what I mean. In our space. Always around. I feel like I can't relax in my own home. And frankly, Daniel, I don't want to be taking care of your mother when she gets really old. I didn't sign up for that." My hands froze on the plates. The dish towel in my hand suddenly felt heavy as a brick. "She's not that bad yet," Daniel said. "And she won't be around forever. Won't be around forever." The casual way he said it, like he was talking about an unwanted houseplant that would eventually die on its own. I set the plates down quietly and walked back to my little house without saying goodbye. They didn't even notice I was gone. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and everything started making sense. The locked doors, the missing food, the controlled thermostat, the legal notice banning me from the property. This wasn't random meanness. This was a plan. But a plan for what? I started paying closer attention to everything. I noticed that my mail sometimes came later than it used to, and when I asked the postal worker about it, he said, "Oh, the young man from the main house asked us to deliver your mail to him first. Said you sometimes miss important things." Daniel was screening my mail. I noticed that repair people who came to work on my little house always talked to him first, never directly to me. When my bathroom faucet started leaking, the plumber told me, "Your son already approved the work and handled the payment. You don't need to worry about anything." I hadn't even known Daniel had called a plumber. I noticed that my landline phone sometimes had a dial tone that sounded different. When I mentioned this to my friend Patricia, she said, "Honey, that sounds like someone might be monitoring your calls." My nephew works in tech, and he told me about this stuff. One morning I decided to test something. I bought a small security camera from the electronics store, just a simple one that I could plug in and watch on my phone. I set it up in my living room, pointed toward the front door, just to see if anyone was coming into my space when I wasn't there. The next day the camera was gone, completely vanished. In its place was a handwritten note. "This isn't necessary. You're safe here." No signature. But I recognized Daniel's handwriting. That's when the fear really set in. Not just sadness or confusion, but actual fear. Someone was controlling every aspect of my life, and that someone was my own son. But why? What was the endgame here? I started thinking about money. Daniel had always been good with finances, even as a kid. He'd saved his allowance, invested his Christmas money, planned everything carefully. When he took over managing my accounts after my hip surgery, I'd been grateful. It was one less thing to worry about during my recovery.
But now I wondered, what exactly was he managing? I called my bank to check on my accounts. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Santos," the representative told me, "but I'm not able to give you information over the phone. Your account has been flagged for additional security measures. You'll need to come in with proper identification and speak with a manager." Security measures? I'd been banking there for 30 years. They knew my voice, my social security number, my mother's maiden name. What kind of security measures required me to prove who I was? When I went to the bank the next day, the manager, a young woman named Lisa who'd always been helpful before, looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Santos, it appears that your son has been designated as a co-signer on your accounts, with authority to make changes for your protection. Any modifications to access would need to be approved by both parties." "What kind of modifications?" I asked. "Well, for instance, there's a note here that you've been experiencing some memory issues, and that Mr. Santos should be consulted before any large withdrawals or changes are made." Memory issues. I'd never told anyone I was having memory issues because I wasn't. My mind was as sharp as it had ever been. Sharper, actually, now that I was paying attention to what was really happening around me. "Who told you I was having memory issues?" I asked. Lisa looked at her computer screen, then back at me. "It's noted here that your son reported some concerns during a phone call last month. He was just looking out for your best interests, I'm sure." My best interests. Everything Daniel had been doing was supposedly for my best interests. The locked thermostat, for my comfort. The mail screening, so I wouldn't miss important things. The controlled access to my own money, for my protection. But protection from what? From whom? That evening, I sat in my little kitchen with a cup of tea and a notebook, writing down everything I could remember. Every strange conversation, every missing item, every small control that had been put in place. The list filled 3 pages. At the top of a clean page, I wrote, "What does Daniel want?" Then I answered my own question, everything. My house, which I'd already signed over to him. My savings accounts, which he now controlled. My daily life, which he was managing piece by piece. And eventually, when I became too much trouble, my absence from his life entirely. The legal notice suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't the beginning of his plan. It was the end of it. He'd been systematically taking control of everything I owned, everything I was, preparing for the day when he could simply remove me from the equation entirely. I picked up my pen and wrote one more thing in the notebook: time to find out exactly how far this goes. Because if Daniel thought he could manipulate me into disappearing quietly, he was about to discover something important about the woman who'd raised him. I might be 72 years old with a bad hip and a trusting heart, but I was still the same person who'd fought insurance companies when they tried to deny Robert's cancer treatments. The same person who'd faced down angry parents when they disagreed with their children's grades. The same person who'd rebuilt her entire life from scratch when the most important person in her world died. I wasn't going anywhere. Not until I knew the truth about what my son had become, and what he was planning to do to me. The next morning, I would start looking for answers. Real answers, the kind that couldn't be explained away with excuses about thermostats and security measures and my best interests. Because something told me that what I'd discovered so far was just the surface of something much deeper and much more dangerous. The morning after I confronted Daniel and Jessica, I woke up before sunrise. Not because I was anxious or afraid, but because something inside me felt lighter than it had in years. I made my coffee and sat by the window, watching the sky turn from black to deep purple to soft pink. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't wondering what small freedom would disappear next. I was simply sitting in my own space, drinking my own coffee, making my own choices. By 8 o'clock, I was on the phone with Patricia, my lawyer. They returned everything, I told her. The keys, the copied documents, even transferred the money back to my original accounts. Daniel called at midnight and said they were complying with all demands. How do you feel about that? Patricia asked. I thought for a moment. Relieved. But also sad. Not because I miss them, but because I'm mourning the son I thought I had. The real Daniel, the one who could plan this whole thing and sleep peacefully for months while doing it, that person was never who I thought he was. What do you want to do now? She asked. I want to start over. Completely. I want a life that's entirely mine, where nobody can control my thermostat or read my mail or forge my signature. I want to remember what it feels like to be Eleanor Santos, not just somebody's mother or somebody's burden. The first thing I did was look for a new place to live. Not because I was running away, but because the guest house felt contaminated now. Every corner held memories of surveillance and control. I needed walls that had never heard lies about my competence, rooms that had never been searched without my permission. That I found a small house about 20 minutes away, in a neighborhood full of mature oak trees and front porches with rocking chairs. It had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with windows facing east for morning light, and a little garden that previous owners had planted with roses and herbs. The realtor, a kind woman named Susan, didn't ask why a woman my age was buying a house by herself. She just showed me the features and respected my decisions. The previous owners were a retired couple, Susan explained as we walked through the empty rooms. They took good care of it. Everything works, and the neighbors are friendly but not intrusive. Friendly but not intrusive. That sounded perfect. Moving was easier than I'd expected. 40 years of teaching had taught me to be organized, and living in the guest house had already forced me to pare down my possessions. I packed my real treasures, my books, my grandmother's china, photos from when Daniel was genuinely happy to see me, my sewing machine, and the wooden jewelry box Robert had made me for our 10th anniversary. I left behind anything that felt heavy with recent memories. The couch where I'd sat pretending not to hear Jessica complaining about my presence. The kitchen table where I'd signed documents I didn't understand. Even some clothes that I'd worn during those awful months of feeling unwelcome in what was supposed to be my home. Moving day was a Saturday. I'd hired movers to handle the furniture, but I carried the important things myself. As I loaded the last box into my car, I looked back at the guest house one more time. Daniel's car was in the driveway of the main house, but he didn't come outside. Part of me wondered if he was watching from a window, but I didn't look. That chapter of my life was closed. My new house smelled like fresh paint and possibilities. The previous owners had left it immaculate, and as I walked through the empty rooms, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about my own future.
I spent the first week just arranging furniture and getting used to the sounds of my new neighborhood. Birds singing in the oak trees, children playing in nearby yards, the gentle hum of air conditioners and lawnmowers, and normal life happening all around me. The neighbors were exactly as Susan had described, friendly but not intrusive. The woman next door, Linda, brought me a casserole and introduced herself, but she didn't ask personal questions or offer unsolicited advice. The elderly man across the street, Carlos, waved when he saw me in the garden and occasionally stopped to chat about roses, but he didn't try to manage my life or suggest improvements I hadn't requested. For the first time in years, I was just a person in the world, not a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed. I established new routines that had nothing to do with anyone else's schedule or needs. I drank my coffee on the front porch every morning, watching the neighborhood wake up. I planted new herbs in the garden, choosing varieties I'd always wanted to try but never had space for. Lavender for tea, lemon balm for cooking, mint that I could use fresh or dry for winter. I bought a small television for the living room and arranged my books on built-in shelves that ran along one entire wall. I set up my sewing machine in the second bedroom and spent peaceful afternoons hemming curtains and mending clothes while listening to classical music on the radio. Most importantly, I started volunteering at the local elementary school. They needed reading tutors, and after 40 years of teaching, I knew I could help. The principal, a young woman named Maria, was delighted to have someone with my experience. "We have several students who are struggling," she explained during my orientation. "Some need help with basic reading skills. Others just need someone to listen to them read and encourage their progress." The first child assigned to me was a 7-year-old named Tommy, who reminded me of Daniel at that age. Curious, energetic, but struggling with letters that seemed to jump around on the page. We worked together twice a week, sitting in a quiet corner of the library, slowly building his confidence with simple books about dogs and trucks and adventures. "Mrs. Santos," he said one afternoon after successfully reading an entire page without help, "you're the best teacher ever." That simple statement filled me with more joy than I'd felt in years. I was useful again, but on my own terms. I was helping, but by choice, not obligation. I was needed, but in a healthy way that energized me instead of draining me. I also started attending a book club at the local library. 8 women of various ages who met every other Tuesday to discuss everything from mysteries to memoirs to classic literature. They welcomed me warmly, and I discovered that I'd missed intellectual conversation more than I'd realized. These women were smart, funny, and interested in the world around them. They asked my opinion and listened to my responses. They included me in their discussions naturally, without making me feel like a charity case or a burden. "Eleanor, what did you think about the author's portrayal of family relationships?" asked Janet, the book club leader, during a discussion of a novel about 3 generations of women. I thought carefully before answering. "I think the author understood something important about family," I said. "That sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who try to control you the most. And that real love requires respecting someone's autonomy, even when you disagree with their choices." The other women nodded thoughtfully, and I realized I was processing my own experience through literature, finding wisdom in stories that helped me understand my own. 3 months after moving to my new house, I did something I'd never done before in my life. I took a vacation by myself. A week in Savannah, Georgia, staying in a small bed and breakfast, exploring historic squares, taking photographs of beautiful architecture, eating meals at whatever time I felt hungry. I'd been afraid it would be lonely, but instead it was liberating. I could spend an entire afternoon in a museum if I wanted to, or change my plans at the last minute because something else caught my interest. I could eat breakfast at 10 in the morning or take a nap in the middle of the day. Every choice was mine. On my last evening in Savannah, I sat in a restaurant overlooking the river, eating shrimp and grits while watching boats drift by in the sunset. At the table next to me, a young couple was arguing about money. At another table, a family with small children was struggling to keep everyone happy and fed. I felt a moment of sympathy for all of them, remembering how complicated life could be when it was tangled up with other people's needs and expectations. But I also felt grateful for my solitude. Not lonely, not isolated, but peacefully alone. I was 72 years old and I was finally living the life I chose for myself. When I returned home, I found a letter in my mailbox. My heart skipped when I saw Daniel's handwriting, but when I opened it, I felt only a mild sadness, like looking at an old photograph of someone who died long ago. "Mom," he'd written, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that Emma and Lucas ask about you sometimes. Jessica thinks we should try family therapy to work through what happened. I know I made mistakes, but you're still my mother, and they're still your grandchildren. Maybe we could find a way to move forward." I read the letter twice, then put it in my desk drawer. Not in the trash because it wasn't written with malice. But not in a place where I'd see it every day either. I thought about Emma and Lucas, my precious grandchildren who'd been taught to avoid me in those final months. I missed them, but I also understood something now that I hadn't before. Children learn about relationships by watching the adults around them. Emma and Lucas had watched their parents lie to me, steal from me, and plan to have me locked away. They'd learned that elderly people are problems to be managed, not human beings to be respected. Maybe someday when they were adults they'd seek me out and want to hear my side of the story. Maybe they'd realize that their grandmother wasn't the confused, burdensome woman their parents had described. But that was their journey to make, not mine to force. As for family therapy with Daniel and Jessica, the idea felt absurd. You can't therapy your way out of fundamental character differences. You can't counsel someone into becoming trustworthy after they've proven they're willing to forge legal documents and plan your imprisonment for financial gain. Some bridges once burned should stay burned. Instead of dwelling on what I'd lost, I focused on what I'd gained. Freedom, peace, self-respect, the ability to make my own decisions without wondering if someone was manipulating me for their own benefit. A life that belonged entirely to me. 6 months after moving to my new house, I was working in my garden when Linda from next door came over to chat. We'd become genuine friends, sharing books and recipes and conversations about everything from politics to gardening tips. "Eleanor," she said, settling into the lawn chair I kept for visitors, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. You seem happier now than when you first moved here. Not that you were unhappy then, but there's something different about you lately. More settled, I guess." I thought about her observation while I watered my tomato plants. "I think," I said finally, "I spent most of my life trying to be what other people needed me to be. A good wife, a good mother, a good teacher. And those were good things to be. But somewhere along the way, I forgot to be myself. And now I'm learning who Eleanor Santos is when she's not trying to please anyone else. It turns out she's someone I actually like." Linda smiled. "I like her too." That evening I sat on my front porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Tomorrow I would tutor Tommy and 2 other children at the school. Next week I had book club. Next month I was planning a trip to visit my college roommate in Colorado, someone I'd lost touch with during the busy years of raising Daniel and caring for Robert. I was building a life based on my own interests, my own values, my own choices. It wasn't the life I'd planned when I was young and thought happiness meant being needed by the people you loved. But it was a good life, maybe even a better life than the one I'd lost. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I whispered a quiet thank you to whatever forces had given me the strength to fight for my freedom. Some people never get the chance to discover who they really are underneath all the roles they play for others. Some people spend their entire lives being what everyone else needs them to be. But not me. Not anymore. At 72 years old, I was finally free to be exactly who I was meant to be. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift I could have given myself. The morning after I confronted Daniel and Jessica, I woke up before sunrise. Not because I was anxious or afraid, but because something inside me felt different. Cleaner. Like I'd been carrying around a heavy weight for months without realizing it. And now it was finally gone. I made my coffee in the quiet darkness and sat by my kitchen window, watching the world wake up around me. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone else to tell me what my day would look like. By 7 in the morning, my phone was already ringing. It was Patricia, my lawyer. "They've returned everything," she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "Daniel called my office at 6 this morning. All the keys, copies of documents, access codes. He also initiated the transfer to put your money back in the original accounts." How did he sound? I asked, surprising myself by caring. Defeated. And scared. I think the reality of potential criminal charges finally hit him. I should have felt victorious, but instead I just felt tired. Not physically tired, but emotionally exhausted from months of living in a state of constant alertness, never knowing what control would be taken away from me next. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Patricia said, "you decide what kind of life you want to build." That afternoon I called my old friend Helen, who'd moved to a retirement community across town 2 years ago. I hadn't spoken to her much since my move to Daniel's guest house, partly because he'd made it difficult to maintain my friendships, and partly because I'd been embarrassed about my living situation. "Eleanor," she said when she heard my voice, "I was just thinking about you. How are you doing?" "Actually," I said, "I'm doing something I should have done months ago. I'm starting over." We talked for an hour. I told her everything that had happened, and she listened without judgment or surprise. "Honey," she said finally, "I wondered if something was wrong. You stopped returning my calls, stopped coming to our lunch dates. That wasn't like you." I was being isolated, I realized. Gradually cut off from everyone who might have noticed what was happening. "Well, you're not isolated anymore. Come see me tomorrow. I want to show you something." Helen lived in a beautiful community called Sunset Gardens, where each resident had their own small cottage but shared common areas for dining and activities. When I visited her the next day, I was struck by how vibrant and alive everyone seemed. These weren't people waiting to die. They were people living fully, just in a different stage of life. "I'm not saying you should move here," Helen said as we walked through the flower gardens that gave the place its name. "But I want you to see that there are options. Good options. Places where being 72 isn't seen as a problem to be managed." That evening, I drove home thinking about possibilities instead of problems. For months, I'd been so focused on what was being taken from me that I'd forgotten I could choose to take things for myself. I could choose where to live, how to spend my time, who to trust with my friendship. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called a real estate agent. "I want to look at houses," I told Susan Matthews, who'd been recommended by a friend. "Small ones with good natural light and maybe a little garden space." "What's your timeline?" she asked. "As soon as possible. I want to start my new life before I lose my nerve." We spent the next week looking at properties. Some were too big, others too isolated. But then Susan showed me a little blue house on Maple Street, just 15 minutes from the library and the community center. It had 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors that gleamed in the afternoon sun, and a backyard filled with fruit trees that the previous owners had planted decades ago. "The kitchen needs updating," Susan said, opening cabinets to show me the dated appliances. "I like it exactly as it is," I said, running my hands along the worn countertops. "It feels like a house where people have been happy." I made an offer that day. While waiting for the paperwork to go through, I started planning my new life with the same methodical approach I'd used to plan lessons for my students. I made lists of what I wanted to keep from my old life and what I wanted to leave behind. I researched volunteer opportunities, community groups, and classes I might want to take. Most importantly, I started telling people the truth about what had happened, not for sympathy or revenge, but because secrets had nearly destroyed me. I called my sister Ruth in Phoenix and told her everything. I reached out to former colleagues from the school where I'd taught. I contacted neighbors from my old house, the one I'd lived in with Robert. "Eleanor, we wondered what happened to you," said Mary Chun, who'd lived next door to Robert and me for 15 years. "Daniel told us you were having health problems and needed constant care." "I'm healthier now than I've been in years," I told her, both physically and emotionally. The conversations weren't always easy. Some people had believed Daniel's stories about my declining mental state. Others had wondered but hadn't wanted to interfere in family business. But most were supportive and offered help with my transition to independent living. Moving day arrived on a crisp October morning. I'd hired professional movers for the furniture, but I packed my personal items myself, taking time to touch each object and decide whether it belonged in my new life. My grandmother's quilt, yes. The photo of Daniel graduating college, no. My collection of mystery novels, yes. The expensive vase Jessica had given me for Christmas, no. As I carried the last box to my car, I looked back at the guest house where I'd spent the most difficult months of my life. The windows were dark, and the little porch where I'd once felt safe looked somehow smaller than I remembered. Daniel's car was in the main driveway, but he didn't come outside. I wondered if he was watching from a window, but I didn't look. That part of my life was over. My new house welcomed me like an old friend. The afternoon light streaming through the living room windows made everything glow golden. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon from spices the previous owners had left behind. Even the creaks in the floorboards sounded friendly rather than threatening. That first night, I sat on my new front porch with a cup of tea, listening to the sounds of my neighborhood. Children playing in a nearby yard. A dog barking in the distance. The rustle of leaves in the fruit trees behind my house. Normal sounds of normal life, with no undertone of surveillance or control. I slept better that night than I had in months. The next few weeks were busy with the practical details of settling in. Changing my address with the bank, the post office, my doctors. Finding a new grocery store and learning the best routes around my neighborhood. But I also started doing things that had nothing to do with necessity and everything to do with joy. I joined the community center's book club, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for when I was managing everyone else's needs. The first meeting I attended, they were discussing a novel about a woman who discovers her husband has been lying to her for years. "What do you think she should do?" asked the group leader, a retired teacher named Barbara. "She should trust her instincts," I said. "If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. And she should stop making excuses for people who don't respect her." The other women nodded, and I realized I was talking about my own experience as much as the fictional characters. I also started volunteering at the local animal shelter, walking dogs and socializing cats who were waiting for new homes. The work was simple but satisfying, and the animals didn't care about my age or my past mistakes. They just wanted attention and kindness, which I had plenty of to give. One Tuesday morning, about a month after moving into my new house, I was working in my garden when a car pulled up to the curb. My heart jumped when I saw Daniel get out, but I forced myself to keep planting bulbs in the flower bed by my front steps. He walked slowly up my driveway, looking around at the house and yard like he was trying to understand something. When he reached the garden where I was working, he stopped and waited for me to acknowledge him. "Hi, Mom," he said finally. I looked up from the tulip bulbs I was planting. He looked older than I remembered, with new lines around his eyes and gray creeping into his hair at the temples. For a moment, I saw the little boy who used to help me plant vegetables in our garden when he was 8 years old. But that moment passed quickly. "Hello, Daniel," I said, returning to my planting. "This is a nice place," he said, gesturing toward the house. "I didn't know you were looking to move." "There are a lot of things you don't know about me," I replied. "That was part of the problem." He shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, I came to apologize. Jessica and we got carried away with trying to help and we made some bad decisions. We never meant to hurt you." I set down my gardening trowel and looked at him directly. "You forged my signature on legal documents, Daniel. You planned to have me declared mentally incompetent so you could control my money and put me in a nursing home. Those weren't bad decisions made with good intentions. Those were crimes planned with criminal intent. I know it looks bad, but it doesn't just look bad. It is bad. And the fact that you're still trying to minimize it tells me you haven't learned anything from this experience." We stood there in silence for a moment, and I could see him struggling with what to say next. Part of me wanted to comfort him the way I had when he was small and upset about something. But I wasn't his mother in that way anymore. I was a woman protecting herself from someone who had proven he couldn't be trusted. "The kids miss you," he said finally. "Emma asked why Grandma doesn't come to dinner anymore." "What did you tell her?" "That you were busy with your new house." I almost smiled at that. It was probably the most honest thing he'd said to anyone in months. I am busy with my new house, and my new life, and my new understanding of what family actually means. What does that mean? It means family members don't spy on each other. They don't steal from each other. They don't forge documents or spread lies about each other's mental health. Real family respects boundaries and choices, even when they disagree with them. Daniel's face flushed. So that's it? You're just going to cut us out of your life completely? I'm not cutting you out, Daniel. You cut yourself out when you decided to treat me like a problem to be solved instead of a person to be respected. I'm just accepting the relationship you chose for us. But what about forgiveness? What about second chances? I stood up slowly, brushing dirt from my knees. Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending something didn't happen. And second chances have to be earned by people who acknowledge what they did wrong and demonstrate real change. Are you prepared to do that? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I don't know how. That's honest at least, I said. When you figure out how to have a relationship based on respect instead of control, you know where to find me. He walked back to his car without another word. I watched him drive away, then returned to planting my tulip bulbs. Come spring, they would bloom into something beautiful and entirely my own choosing. 3 months later, I received a letter from Emma, my granddaughter. Someone had helped her with the spelling, but the handwriting was clearly hers. Dear Grandma, it said, I hope you like your new house. I made you a picture of flowers for your garden. Love, Emma. Inside the envelope was a crayon drawing of a garden filled with impossibly large flowers in every color imaginable. At the bottom, she'd drawn a small figure with gray hair and a big smile, labeled Grandma. I put the picture on my refrigerator and wrote Emma a letter back, telling her about my real garden and the animals at the shelter and the books I was reading. I mailed it to her school instead of her home, suspecting Daniel and Jessica were still monitoring what came into their house. A week later, another letter arrived from Emma, this one with a picture of a cat that looked remarkably like one of the shelter cats I'd told her about. We began a correspondence that continued for months, with no involvement from her parents. Through Emma's letters, I learned that she was smart, curious, and kind. She worried about stray animals and asked thoughtful questions about why some people were mean to others. She was becoming the person she was meant to be, despite the complicated family she'd been born into. I never answered her questions about why I didn't come to family dinners anymore. That conversation would have to wait until she was old enough to understand the difference between a grandmother who chose to stay away and a grandmother who was pushed away. On my 73rd birthday, I threw myself a party. Not a big celebration, just the book club ladies and some neighbors and Helen from Sunset Gardens. We ate cake on my back porch and talked about everything except the past. When someone asked what I wanted for the next year of my life, I said, more of this. More choosing my own company, my own activities, my own definition of happiness. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea and thought about the journey that had brought me to this place. A year ago, I'd been living in someone else's house, following someone else's rules, trusting someone who was systematically stealing my autonomy and planning my imprisonment. Now I was living in my own house, making my own decisions, surrounded by people who valued my friendship rather than trying to control my life. I had work that mattered, relationships that nourished me, and most importantly, the knowledge that I was strong enough to protect myself when necessary. The woman who had signed away her independence without reading the fine print was gone. In her place was someone who understood that kindness without boundaries is just another form of imprisonment, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's harmful behavior. I was finally completely, authentically myself. And that turned out to be exactly who I was supposed to be all along.